Well, some of you probably heard this on your national news, but some of you might not. Fidel Castro has apparently resigned as the president of Cuba, according to the statement made in a state-run newspaper. He took power in 1959. My, oh my. I've seen them all. He's outlived all, hasn't he? All of them. 81 years old, but it looks like he's handed his power temporarily over to his younger brother, Raul, who's not that young. And we'll see what happens. Maybe one day we'll start having Cuban cigars back in the country. You never know. I'll be back in a moment. Laurence Gardner, our guest, right here on Coast to Coast AM. Planet keeps changing, Lawrence, doesn't it? Leaders come and go. It's amazing.
It certainly does, yeah. I mean, it seems, as you say, like he'd go on forever, but there you go.
Yeah, absolutely.
Things come to an end. I just had a look. The National Assembly is meeting on the 24th to elect the successor, but it looks like it'll be Raul.
It'll be interesting to see what, if any, changes between our country and theirs with Raul in there. He's not as militant as his brother.
No, it will be interesting to see, and, you know, like you say, nothing lasts forever, and let's hope that this will sort itself out now.
Now, the Ark of the Covenant, you started bringing up something fascinating, what it might consist of, what it might do, what it is. Tell me a little bit about that.
Well, let's just start off with what it's described as being in terms of its construction.
Okay.
And again, we only have the Bible here, so we have to, you know, if we're going to take anything as read, that's all we've got. Its measurements are given in cubits, which is a variable measurement between 18 and 22 inches. But taken at the lowest estimate, what you have is a box that was 45 inches in length and 27 inches wide by 27 inches high. So it's about 4 foot by 2 foot and 2 foot high, this box. It says it's plated inside and out with gold, and that its lid was made of solid gold. And on top of that were a couple of cherubim, whatever they were. Now let's forget the box and just think of the lid. I was fascinated by this lid. I thought, well, if you've got a lid that is 4 feet by 2 feet, and it's nothing but gold, if it's solid gold, apart from the fact that it's very dense and enormously heavy, it's actually quite a soft metal.
Mm-hmm.
And so it would have to be reasonably thick to avoid bowing in the center of this box. Well, the Bible, again, actually tells us that it was a palm span in depth. Now, a palm span, it was actually a measurement in those times, and a palm span was roughly equal to about 3.5 inches. So what you've got is 4 feet by 2 feet by 3.5 inches. That's a solid gold lid. Now, I got fascinated by this lid, and I got onto the World Gold Council, and I said, look, what the hell would this be worth, and what would it weigh? It would be enormous. You know, gold's as heavy as lead. Anyway, it transpired that they worked it out for me and came back, and they said that as far as they could ascertain, its weight roughly would be about 2,714 pounds. 4 feet by 2 feet by 3.5 inches. 2,714 pounds.
Wow, what could be created to make it that heavy? It had to be heavy gold. Lots of gold.
Yeah, tons of gold. I mean, 2,240 pounds are a ton, and this is 2,700 odd pounds. So what you've got is a lid that effectively seems to weigh more than a ton. And I said to them, what's that worth? And at the time, this was a couple of years ago, they said, well, that would be worth today about $10.5 million, just the lid. So we don't know. I mean, we don't know whether the Bible exaggerates here or whether it doesn't, but those are what we're given. Even if it were half that, and the Gold Council told me, well, if it was half that, it would bow anyway. It would need to be that more or less that thick to stay stable with these cherubim, whatever they were on top. And so, you know, this is what begins to make nonsense of this son of King Solomon sort of secreting it out of the palace at night and taking it to Ethiopia.
Yeah, you can't just walk. How many people would it take to carry something like that?
Goodness. Well, I don't know. Think of a car. I mean, I don't know what an average car would weigh, a ton to a ton and a half, maybe a ton and a half, something like that. How many people would it take to lift a car? I guess 8 people could do it.
And walk away with it? But for how long?
Well, no, not for long. I mean, you could lift it and perhaps move it a foot or two, you know. I mean, I remember once being at the site of an accident where a lady had been run down by a car, and this was a Volvo saloon, and she was actually underneath the car, and it was leaking fuel and whatever, we had to get her out. The fire brigade hadn't arrived, and we didn't lift the whole car, but it took, I think, about 6 or 8 of us just to lift one side of it up enough for others to pull her out.
Okay.
So you wouldn't be able to carry it very far. And so these, you know, if this weight is correct, if these sizes and weights are correct, then the pictures that we get of the ark just being carried by, you know, 4 guys and a couple of wooden staves wouldn't work.
All those things would have snapped.
You'd need more than that, but it doesn't say how many it took to carry it. It simply said it was carried on staves that were slipped through rings on its side. And so you have, you know, this contraption here, which is enormously weighty. Now, interestingly, if we move from the Bible, and again here, you know, we can only go by what we're told, but if we move into other Jewish literature outside of the Bible from the early period, the point that it makes is when the ark was placed in the Holy of Holies in Solomon's temple, it always stood 3 fingers height above the ground. It described that it levitated. It was from this, apparently, that originally, remember, the Ark of the Covenant was said to be made by Bezalel and Moses in Sinai, and it was that time, in fact, when the Levite priesthood was founded. Moses formed the Levites to be the guardians of the ark. And in Latin, the term levis, as against gravis, which means heavy, levis means light.
Light, yeah.
And what you have is this situation where this story of its levitation seems to perhaps tie in with Levites and the fact that it was somehow or other light. It was said that the ark moved before the troops when they went into battle. Now, it doesn't say that people were or weren't carrying it, so we don't know, but it just says it moved before the troops. Now, if it's moving before the troops, it's got to be going at a reasonable speed, so clearly somebody's got to be carrying it. But think of the weight again. You know, it's going to have to be something that perhaps is possibly levitational in its own right in some way.
You don't think it was some
to enable them to move it that quickly?
You don't think it was some kind of craft or anything, do you?
I don't think it was a craft, no. But I mean, it doesn't really matter what I think. What it did seem to have was amazing powers of destruction. They took it into battle. It won battles. If you go through the battles,
what do you mean it won battles?
Was
it a weapon?
Whenever they took the ark into battle, they won the battles. Whenever they didn't take the ark into battle, they didn't win those battles. And it was the ark that seemingly helped to bring down the walls of Jericho, for example. It killed people. It shot out bolts of lightning. You know, it seemed to sort of be producing very, very high-powered electrical charges of some sort.
It sounds like some kind of electromagnetic pulse weapon.
It sounds like a capacitor, and in actual fact, when it's reconstructed, it is identical in design to the first arc light capacitors that were used for street lights.
Was it a laser?
I don't think it was a laser. I think it was simply a very, very powerful capacitor. Think about its construction. It's made of wood, so what you have is an insulator. It is plated inside and out with gold, so you have negative and positive. You have a solid gold lid overall, which is now touching the negative and the positive, and you have on top these 2 cherubim, whatever shape they were. Now, if they are a negative and positive pole linked, one to the outside plating and one to the inside plating, that would be exactly what was needed for electrical charging. And the word arcing, as in electricity, seems to have come directly from that sort of technology.
What would they have used it for, Laurence? I mean, besides a weapon?
Well, it clearly was a weapon. Its story is interesting because it's one of two very major stories in that Sinai period. Moses had brought the Israelites out of Egypt. They were camped at this Mount Horeb in Sinai. That was where Moses got the Ten Commandments and the tables of testimony and that sort of thing. But the two big stories that came out of it were one about the building of the Ark of the Covenant, and the other one, the story of the golden calf. Now, the golden calf story, which links to the Ark story, is really what started to get me interested in what became the white powder gold research, in as much as that the story is that by burning this, I mean, Moses had gone up the mountain, his brother and the Israelites had got fed up because he'd been up there for so long. Yeah. When he came down, his brother said, look, I've collected up all the golden rings and stuff from the Israelites, and I've melted them down, and I've made this golden calf, and we're now going to worship this golden calf, and this God thing of yours is not on the cards for us. And Moses apparently got very angry, and the story is that he then burnt the golden calf with fire, transposed it into a powder, mixed the powder with water, and fed it to the Israelites.
Okay.
As if that was some sort of punishment. But, I mean, it sounds more like a ritual than a punishment.
Right.
But what struck me was the tying in with this, with the ark, with the electricity, and it says that he burnt the calf with fire and it became powder. But that simply doesn't happen. You know, if you heat or burn gold, it becomes molten gold. You know, it doesn't become
melts down.
Powder.
Yeah.
It just melts. And so there had to be more to it. So my feeling is that this is actually the beginning of a piece of history that moves through to King Solomon. King Solomon had this great brazen laver in his courtyard full of this white powder. We get to King Herod. Herod was apparently from the same temple. He was trading powder with the kings of Jordan. They were supplying him with all sorts of stuff in return in ways of technology and hydraulics and things like that. It seemed to me that there was very possibly a connection here, and what began to pin it together for me were older pieces of history from Mesopotamia, where the white powder gold in the olden days, real old days, was referred to as bread. They called it bread, white bread.
Was it manna?
The bread of life and the bread of light. Well, again, we have a similar situation in Sinai, where they have this white stuff that they eat, and it's called bread. And when you read the story of King Solomon, and this is quite interesting here because it's not written like this in the English translations. It's only in the original text that you find this, or the old text before translation. And we get back to King Solomon here, which is where we began tonight. What King Solomon was trading with these other nations in order to get their ships and their chariots and their horses and everything else that they were supplying him with was said to be bread.
Food.
He traded bread for their households. And they kept supplying him with gold for this bread. So it's kind of interesting that the stories begin to pull together. So the ark, it struck me, was very possibly linked up with this story, in as much as that when it said Moses burned the gold with fire, what we're probably looking at is an electronic device here being used, very, very high power charging.
How would they know how to come up with that?
I don't know. I mean, it's like so many inventions. You look at them and you think, why would anybody have thought of that? How would they have thought of that? You know, where would it have come from? But in terms of electricity, I mean, we figure that electricity really came into being in the middle 1700s, and that certainly things like electrolysis, gold plating, that sort of thing, 1750s we're looking at, that sort of period. Now, in the year 1999 and running into its publication in 2000, there was a Harvard University and British Museum team out in Turkey. And they were investigating a gold refinery of a king called Croesus, who actually introduced the first gold coinage into the world in about 850 BC. And what they discovered out there were examples of the most wonderful gold plating. They tested it, they tried it, they did everything they could with it, and they said, we couldn't better it today, and it's the best form of electrolysis they've ever seen. Now, everybody said that's impossible, because there was no such thing then. They didn't have electricity then, and the British Museum said, well, look, we're going to write this book and we'll tell you all about it. So they did, and it's explained that, in fact, electrolysis was being used to do gold plating in about 800-odd BC. Now, that got the British Museum quite interested in how much older it might have been.
Right.
So they went back to some of their other items in their collection. They were looking at things which had been found from ancient Mesopotamia, 2,500 to 3,000 BC, that dated from the royal graves and that sort of thing in Ur. And they'd always thought they were solid gold, these daggers and various things that they had. It turned out that they weren't. They were made out of some sort of enormously heavy alloy plated with gold. And gold plating was impossible then. It wasn't possible until the 1750s. And so in the year 2000, the whole thing got blown apart. That they not only had electricity back in those times, they knew exactly how to use it for specific purposes, and gold plating was one of them.
Well, as you write in one of your books, The Lost Secrets of the Sacred Art, this is fascinating. It truly is, just going back. Laurence, I want to talk about Freemasonry after our break, because it is tied into everything we've been talking about.
It is, in a way, yeah. Yeah, it is.
And, of course, the Templars, as we move out of them, we'll get into the Freemasons, which, in your opinion, do they still exist today? I'm not talking about the Shriners and the great things they do for hospitals and children, but the deep Freemasonry organization, is that still around?
No, is the short answer to that is no. I mean, we can get into this after the break. There is no similarity at all today, hardly anything whatever, between Freemasonry now and Freemasonry as it was before the early 1700s. It changed totally between the years 1688 and 1720.
The fact that we've always heard that so many U.S. presidents, for example, have been Freemasons.
Yeah.
I mean, that tells me it's a very powerful group.
Oh, yeah. I mean, it is a very powerful group. I mean, Freemasonry isn't set up these days to be a powerful group. It's a club of all sorts, and it's charitably based and all that sort of thing. And a lot of people belong to Freemasons. I mean, presidents and candlestick makers, there's no limit. So the fact that a number of presidents happen to be Freemasons means very little. A lot of shopkeepers happen to be Freemasons. A lot of postmen happen to be Freemasons. So when one looks at any particular group of people, one is bound to find a reasonable percentage of them that are Freemasons. And all of us know far more people than we think we know who are Freemasons. I mean, we all know Freemasons. I was one for 20 years. We all know them, but there's a lot of people who don't tell us that they're Freemasons. So the proportion is reasonably high. I mean, it's the largest membership club in the world overall, so every street's got Freemasons in it.
Well, the subtitle of your book, The Shadow of Solomon, is The Lost Secret of the Freemasons Revealed. Let's find out what that is. We'll be back. Well, next hour, we'll open up the phone lines. Let you chat with Laurence Gardner. Lots to talk with him about, though. The Lost Secret of the Freemasons Revealed. He's got that in his book, The Shadow of Solomon. Back in a moment on Coast to Coast AM. They're lining up to talk with you already, Laurence, but we'll do it next hour.
Okay.
The Lost Secret of the Freemasons Revealed, part of The Shadow of Solomon. What do you mean by that? The Lost Secret. What is it, Lost Secret?
It's the subtitle of the book. In general terms, publishers generally have more to do with selecting subtitles than authors do, and at least they have done in my case.
Tell me about
I think if I'd have had more of a say in that and kept the same subtitle, I would have used the plural, being secrets rather than secrets. I mean, it sounds as if there's one
only
big
one
thing.
Yeah.
I mean, there is one big secret, I suppose, and it doesn't amount to a lot in the first instance, in as much as I said, Freemasonry has changed such a lot. And one of the premises within Freemasonry is that they are actually, at least from the year 1723, the brethren are told that their job is to search for their secret, or their secrets. The biggest secret, I suppose, that exists today within Freemasonry is that they don't know what the secret or secrets really are. I mean, there's a lot of ritual, a lot of ceremony, and a lot of good stuff that goes on, but it all revolves around being relevant to the secret or secrets when they discover what they are. And so that I would say is the big secret. There isn't one, and so therefore it becomes a secret, because who wants to admit that? I mean, I spent 20 years wondering what it was. I was introduced into Freemasonry in the middle 1960s. I became a Grand Lodge Master Mason in London. I couldn't have risen much higher in 20 years, and at the end of it, I still wasn't quite sure what it was that was so special that I was supposed to be learning. And I ended up resigning and sort of thinking, well, I can really do better on my own from this, because there are various books and texts that are mentioned that go back to Renaissance times and that sort of era, which it suggested that one should read, but nobody ever reads them. So I figured I'd start looking back into these things and to find out what it was all about. And the biggest break that I found happened in the early 1700s, and it was actually all to do with the build-up towards the Jacobite rebellions. Freemasonry to that point in time, and it had come from a number of sources. It had come in through France and through Scotland. It had come in partly through Templarism, partly through stonemasons' guilds. But ultimately, in England, during the 1600s, its philosophical arm, and in fact Freemasonry in England, which became the sort of center of Freemasonry and the main focus of it, ended up coming from within the Royal Society of London, which is the great scientific institute which still exists today. It's our primary scientific academy. And at that time, those that were involved in this first sort of English Freemasonic institute were people like Christopher Wren and Robert Boyle, Edmund Halley, Isaac Newton, and all of these great scientists and philosophers and people of that middle era. Now, when 1688 came and the Stuart King James II was deposed, Freemasonry really fell apart at the seams in England. And remember, Freemasonry in other countries sort of went out from here after that. By the 1714, we had a new dynasty in charge. This was the Hanoverian dynasty in from Germany of King George I, and then the second, and then the third. And what happened was that the true documents of Freemasonry and what it was all about didn't get passed on from one dynasty to the next. And so the Georges began to reign, really running a royal society who was keeping secrets from the king. And so a new constitution was drawn up, I mean, in 1723, and this is available today. I mean, one can read the constitution, and it's a very interesting constitution. And what it really says in a nutshell is that we have now, from this date, to revise and reform Freemasonry, because the secrets that were held in the order were all lost by Sir Christopher Wren. So they blamed poor old Christopher Wren, the great architect of London after the fire, for losing all of the secrets of Freemasonry, and they had to start again. And from that date, they turned it into what became the Freemasonry that we know now. It became more club-like. It became more involved in business. It became to do with charities.
Sure.
They had schools and hospitals and this sort of thing. And yeah, it was, it was all terribly nice, but it wasn't what it was. What it was before 1688, when the Stuarts were deposed, was wholly scientific. It was a philosophical institute which had been formed in England by King Charles II in 1662, and he'd brought the concept in from Scotland, because the Stuarts were Scottish in the first place, before they became kings of England as well, and he devised it on a basis of a Templar philosophical order called the Elder Brethren of the Rosy Cross. Now, this Elder Brethren of the Rosy Cross were basically scientists. And so it fell into the lap of the Royal Society. All of these great scientists that we know from that period who came up with all the remarkable discoveries of gravity and everything else did it from basically what was a Freemasonic institute. A lot of their stuff was published, a lot of their stuff wasn't. What I did find that was remarkably interesting was that certain things did actually get lost in time. Not everything was carried on because the King Georges limited the research that was going on within this establishment. They said, you're only going to research what we want you to research from now on. So they were kind of stuck. But in 1950, at Cambridge University, a whole load of completely unknown written documentation from Isaac Newton was discovered. Over 1 million words of writing and papers that he'd written about the work that he'd done, but was never ever published. It was never worked on. And it was his work with Robert Boyle. It was his work with other scientists of the Institute at the time.
So pretty phenomenal stuff.
Pretty phenomenal stuff. And one of the papers that grabbed my attention within that was a very lengthy treatise which he called Manna. Called it simply Manna.
It all comes back to that, doesn't it?
It all comes back to that, and it was within this that he claimed that whatever sciences that they were endeavoring to discover now, they were living in the shadow of Solomon, working in the shadow of Solomon. He claimed that the technology that was used for King Solomon's temple what was in itself a technology, almost that the temple itself was a mathematical piece of science. And maybe it was, because the Bible goes to great lengths to give us mathematical explanations of its construction and the width and the height and the breadth of everything within it, So anyway, he drew the temple, he worked it out grammatically, and it all ended up with this manna. And as I mentioned before, Solomon had this great laver in his courtyard, which was meant to contain this bread, this powder that he was trading with all of this other stuff. And what we discovered was that Robert Boyle, in the first instance, he's the guy that Boyle's law comes from. He was interested in gas pressures and all of this sort of thing. But he was an alchemist of a very high regard. He was probably one of the wealthiest men in Britain or in England at the time. He was the son of the Earl of Cork. And he really didn't have any need to work at all. He was incredibly wealthy, but he really got stuck into this scientific environment. And he wrote about this powder, explaining that it defied gravity and various other things. So it became kind of magical. And for me, it again tied in, this powder turns up not only in ancient Mesopotamian times, it turns up in the times of Moses, it turned up in the time of Solomon, it turned up in the time of King Herod, it turned up again in the time of the Templars, and there it was again in the time of the Royal Society. But again, it got lost. And this seemed to be part of what Freemasonry was said to be about.
Why does it get lost, Laurence?
It was lost quite simply because of the fact that it was kept under wraps and then got lost or mislaid, one might say. You know, what we had this change of dynasty, and it really altered everything in Britain. And what you have to realise is that Wren and all the rest of them in that institute were supporters of the Stuart dynasty. The Stuart dynasty in 1688 was kicked out of the country, and by 1714 we had this German monarchy coming in. And from then on, we had all of these battles that ended up with the big Jacobite rebellion in 1745-6. And throughout the whole of that period, just about everybody in the country supported one side or the other. They were either Jacobites and supported the Stuart kings, who were then in exile, or they were Georgian Whigs, and they supported the Hanoverian monarchy, and they didn't work together. They didn't pass secrets on to each other. So there was no way that a Stuart Royal Society was going to allow its secrets and the things that it was working on to fall into the hands of this new regime. And so what would have happened, and in fact what did happen by all accounts, is that the information was withheld. The new style of Freemasonry was brought into being. It's really quite interesting in as much as the new constitution was drawn up within weeks of Christopher Wren's death in 1723. They blamed him and his friends for everything, and the others by that time were pretty well all dead. And Isaac Newton wasn't. He sort of just fell in line and carried on doing his own thing. He was working on gravity then. And what seems to have happened after that is that it simply got forgotten about. Not lost, forgotten about, mislaid. Papers went missing. Nobody knew where they were. And Freemasonry had become about something completely different. And it wasn't really until these papers were discovered in 1950 that it wasn't then, but looking back at it, it was what intrigued me to start looking further. I mean, I discovered all sorts of little things that went on. You know, there was a book called Longitude a few years ago, which talked about the concept of calculating longitude and the man that did it. And it transpired that it wasn't him that did it at all. The papers are all there. They turned up again in another hall at a different university. They'd all been worked out by Robert Hooke and the Freemasons of the Royal Society back in the early 1660s.
Well, why does it seem that there's a conspiracy or surrounding the Freemasons? I mean, almost like they're part of the Illuminati or the one world government.
Well, I mean, the thing is, within Freemasonry, like within anything, you're going to get your good guys and your bad guys. There's bound to be conspiracies that go on. Freemasonry itself isn't a conspiracy. I mean, I never felt it or saw anything of it in my 20 years. I saw little conspiracies going on, business things, but nothing on a major level. I suppose if I'd have belonged to a lodge that had presidents and prime ministers in it, I would have seen conspiracies at that level. But it's not about being a conspiracy. It's simply a place for people of like minds to sort of meet and do their thing, and a lot of what they do is pretty good stuff. I think what the biggest problem is that they are regarded as being a secret society in the first place, which actually they're not. Everybody knows about Freemasonry. The constitutions are published. You can find the rituals and the ceremonies in any library. One doesn't have to keep secret the fact that one is a member of Freemasonry. So there's nothing secret about it, except for one aspect, and that is that within the ritual, there are certain things within the ritual which are sort of meaningless, really, these days. And it's said that the brethren must not reveal these things to any outsider. And so although it's not a secret society, it's secretive. It's society with secrets. But
what were they hiding, Laurence?
Well, when one looks at them and reads them, and this is what baffled me going through this, was that, I mean, one of the things, for example, is that it is announced as part of the ritual with a great flourish, as if it's an amazing revelation, that the earth revolves around the sun. And this is one of the things that you're not really supposed to talk about. Well, the fact is, if you look back in time, you can work out why this happened. When Freemasonry was being developed, as it came in from the 1400s, in from France, into Scotland, into the 1500s, moving through that Renaissance period when the church controlled everything, anyone who had dared to utter that sentence, the earth revolves around the sun, would have been a heretic.
That's true.
Could have been punished, could have been executed.
Yes.
And so consequently, at that particular time, during that period, they had secrets. They weren't really secrets. They were things that they daren't talk about except among themselves. So what they did was that they invented a whole system of signs and tokens and secret handshakes, that sort of thing, so that they knew who was whom, and they could work out who was a fellow brother at that time, who they could discuss these things with openly, and who they mustn't. And so, one can see how it was that these things came into being. The other aspect of it, of course, was that branches of Freemasonry in the early days came out of stonemasonry and the guilds in France when they were building the cathedrals. So you had these guilds of masons. And the Masons had their own passwords and marks. They used to put their marks on buildings, and that Masons' marks, we know about those. But, they used to move around. They were very transient. They even moved from country to country, these stone workers. And what actually happened was that as you went through the degrees, you were given the sign or the token or the handshake or whatever of that new degree, so that when you went to an employer, he would immediately know what degree you were, what standing you were, what sort of job he could give you. And so you were never in a position to get a job that was above your station or above your qualification. So there are all sorts of reasons for these sort of secrety things coming in. But in terms of modern conspiracy, I suppose it comes about because of the fact that there are many prominent and very powerful and very influential people who are Freemasons and make no secret of it. And on that basis, it seems to be deduced by some that is what Freemasonry is about. It's about power and control and all of this sort of thing. Well, yes, okay, there are people within it that are after exactly that. There are people who join Freemasonry at a very low level just to, get together with other lawyers if they're trying to raise their status in the legal profession. So people use it for all that sort of thing. But, just because the latest axe murderer turns out to be a Freemason, it doesn't mean that Freemasonry is about teaching you to be axe murderers.
Sure, unless 10 of them showed up that way.
That's right, yeah. But, people move into Freemasonry, it seems, in much the same way that I did. One gets involved in a business environment. People want you to join their clubs. It might be the Rotary or the Round Table, or it might be Freemasonry or whatever. And one moves into it without really knowing what it's all about, because it's all secret. They can't tell you. So it's not until one gets in that you then begin to learn and to go through the processes and go through the degrees. All I can say is that as I went through all of that, I was waiting and waiting and waiting and waiting for the big revelation. I was waiting for what was finally going to come, what I would know that was so important today. And all I learned was a whole load of stuff that seemed to be very important in 1700.
Let's talk a little bit when we come back, Laurence, about white powder again. And I remember during a past discussion, you said it had these incredible properties, and we'll get that taken. Also, we'll take some phone calls. We'll open up the phone lines. You want to talk with Laurence Gardner about the Ark of the Covenant, the Shadow of Solomon's Treasure, the Freemasons, also the white powder of gold. Phone lines will be wide open in just a moment. I'm George Norrie, back in a moment on Coast to Coast AM.